The year was 1775. A great and powerful feeling was sweeping through the 13 American colonies. This feeling was a desire for freedom. For years, the colonists had felt that the King of Great Britain, King George III, was not treating them fairly. He had placed taxes on them without their consent, on things like tea and paper. The colonists believed they should have a say in their own laws and their own lives. This was not just a small disagreement, it was a deep and growing divide. The people in America were starting to see themselves not just as British subjects, but as something new, Americans. This powerful idea would soon lead to a great conflict, a war for independence. This growing unrest had already burst into violence. Just a few months earlier in April, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord. Massachusetts militia, ordinary men like farmers and blacksmiths, had stood up to the professional soldiers of the British Army. After those first clashes, thousands of colonial militiamen from all over New England gathered around the city of Boston. They surrounded the city, trapping the British forces inside. The air was thick with tension. Everyone knew that another bigger battle was coming. The question was not if, but when and where the next fight would take place. The American colonists were not a trained army. They were a collection of militias, brave men who had left their fields and shops to fight for a cause they believed in. They had passion and knowledge of the land, but they lacked the discipline, the uniforms, and the powerful weapons of the British regulars. The British soldiers, often called redcoats because of their bright red uniforms, were considered the best fighting force in the world. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and had fought in wars across the globe. They were confident that they could easily crush this colonial rebellion and restore the king's order. This set the stage for a dramatic confrontation. The colonists wanted to prove they could stand against the might of the British Empire. The British wanted to show the colonists that resistance was futile and that their army was unbeatable. The city of Boston, a key port, became the center of this brewing storm. The hills surrounding the city offered a strategic advantage to whichever side could control them. It was on one of these hills, across the Charles River from Boston, that the resolve of both sides would be tested in a fierce and bloody battle that no one would ever forget. The battle took place on June 17, 1775. Although it is famously known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, most of the fighting actually happened on a nearby, smaller hill called Breed's Hill. These hills were located on the Charlestown Peninsula, just across the water from Boston. The American commanders learned that the British were planning to seize these unoccupied hills. Taking control of this high ground would give the British cannons a clear shot at the American positions in the surrounding countryside. The colonists knew they had to act first. They needed to fortify the hills to keep the British pinned down in Boston and maintain their siege of the city. Under the cloak of darkness on the night of June 16, a force of about 1,200 colonial militiamen quietly marched onto the peninsula. Their commander was an experienced soldier named Colonel William Prescott. Their orders were to build fortifications on Bunker Hill, the taller of the two hills. However, for reasons that are still debated by historians, they ended up building their main defensive structure, a small fort made of earth called a redoubt, on the lower Breed's Hill. This position was closer to Boston and more directly threatening to the British ships in the harbor. All through the night, the men worked tirelessly with shovels and picks, digging trenches and piling up dirt walls. When the sun rose on the morning of June 17th, the British were stunned. From their ships and their camps in Boston, they looked across the river and saw a new, menacing fort that had seemingly appeared overnight. The sight of the rebel flag flying over the crude earthen walls was an act of defiance they could not ignore. The captain of the British warship HMS Lively was the first to react, ordering his cannons to open fire on the American position. Soon, other British ships and batteries joined in, beginning a bombardment that would last for hours. The colonists, however, hunkered down behind their walls and continued to improve their defenses, waiting for the inevitable ground assault. The American forces were led by men like Colonel Prescott and General Israel Putnam, who famously gave the order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." This was not just a brave saying, it was a practical command. The colonists were short on gunpowder and ammunition, and their muskets were not very accurate over long distances. They had to make every single shot count. They knew they could not afford to waste their precious supplies. By waiting until the enemy was very close, they could maximize the damage of their gunfire and hopefully repel the well-trained British soldiers who would soon be marching up the hill toward them. The British commander in Boston, General Thomas Gage, knew he had to crush this rebellion immediately. He ordered a full-scale assault on the American position. He chose one of his best officers, Major General William Howe, to lead the attack. Over 2,000 British soldiers were loaded onto boats and ferried across the Charles River to the base of the peninsula. Dressed in their heavy wool uniforms and carrying about 60 pounds of equipment, they formed into long, perfect lines. It was a hot summer day, and the soldiers would have to march up a steep hill, through tall grass and over fences, directly into the face of the fortified colonists. The British advanced with great confidence. They were the king's professional army, and they expected the amateur colonial militia to run away at the first sight of their gleaming bayonets. General Howe ordered his men to march up the hill in neat rows, a standard European battle tactic. As the first wave of redcoats got closer and closer to the American lines, the colonists remained silent, holding their fire just as they had been commanded. The tension was immense. The British soldiers continued their steady, disciplined advance, climbing over the uneven ground, expecting the rebels to break and flee at any moment. When the British were just a few dozen yards away, Colonel Prescott finally gave the order to fire. A massive volley of musket balls tore through the British ranks. The effect was devastating. The front lines of the redcoats were shattered, with hundreds of men falling dead or wounded. The disciplined British soldiers, shocked by the ferocity of the American defense, faltered, broke formation, and retreated back down the hill in confusion. The Americans had held their ground. A great cheer went up from the redoubt as they watched the world's finest army running away from them. But the British were not so easily defeated. General Howe, though shaken, was a determined commander. He regrouped his forces and ordered a second assault. Once again, the redcoats marched bravely up the hill, and once again the colonists waited until they were close before unleashing another deadly volley of fire. The result was the same as the first time. The British lines were torn apart and they were forced to retreat back down the hill, leaving even more of their comrades behind on the grassy slope. The Americans had now repelled 2 full-scale attacks from the British army, proving their courage and resolve. After the second failed assault, the scene on the slopes of Breed's Hill was grim. The grass was littered with the bodies of British soldiers, yet General Howe was determined to take the hill. He ordered his men to prepare for a third and final attack. This time, he changed his tactics. He commanded his soldiers to drop their heavy packs, fix their bayonets, and advance in columns rather than wide lines, concentrating their force to break through the American defenses. The British officers knew that the colonists must be running low on ammunition after repelling 2 major attacks. This final push would be a desperate, all-or-nothing effort. Inside the American redoubt, the situation was dire. The commander's fears had come true. The colonists had nearly run out of gunpowder. They had fired their last shots and had very few bayonets to defend themselves in close-quarters combat. As the British soldiers surged up the hill for the third time, the Americans could only offer scattered resistance. The redcoats swarmed over the earthen walls of the fort, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting began. The colonists, armed with little more than the butts of their muskets and rocks, were overwhelmed. Colonel Prescott had no choice but to order a retreat. The British had finally captured the hill, but they had paid a terrible price for it. The battle was a victory for the British, as they had achieved their objective of taking the high ground. However, it was what is known as a Pyrrhic victory. The cost of winning was so high that it felt like a defeat. Out of the roughly 2,200 British soldiers who fought, more than 1,000 were killed or wounded. This was a staggering loss, especially among the officer corps. The Americans had also suffered casualties, but their losses were much smaller. They had proven that they could stand and fight against the best army in the world. The Battle of Bunker Hill was a critical turning point in the American mindset. Although they had lost the ground, the colonists had won a massive moral victory. The heavy British casualties sent a shockwave through London and showed that the American colonists were not a disorganized mob, but a determined and capable fighting force. The battle boosted American confidence and inspired more people to join the revolutionary cause. It demonstrated that the fight for independence would be a long, hard, and bloody war, but it was a war that the Americans now believed they could win. The courage shown on that hill fueled the spirit of 1776 and the ultimate quest for freedom.